Story. Struggling mechanic fixes billionaire's boat engine. Everyone failed. Her response will make you weep. The air in Lee & Son Mechanical tasted of coolant, gasoline, and a hint of rust, the metallic perfume of history and hard work. To anyone else, it was the smell of decay. To Maya Lee, it was the smell of home. The garage itself was a relic, a single-story brick building squeezed between a laundromat and a boarded-up convenience store, a holdout from an era before chrome and glass automotive centers became the norm. Its name, painted in faded blue letters on the grime-streaked sign, was a constant, aching reminder. Lee & Son. Her father had always dreamed of a son to carry on the family trade. Instead, he got Maya, a daughter who understood the language of machines better than he ever had. This afternoon, her patient was a tired Ford F-150, its engine sputtering with a rattling cough that sounded like a smoker's last gasp. The truck's owner, Old Man Hemlock, had already been to 3 other shops. They had charged him a small fortune to replace the spark plugs, the fuel filter, and the distributor cap, all to no effect. They had used computers and scanners, plugging into the truck's brain only to come up with nothing. Maya didn't need a computer. She had her hands and her ears. She leaned over the engine bay, her dark ponytail brushing against the hood. Her worn, navy blue overalls, a size too big, bore the ghosts of 1,000 repairs in the form of grease stains and oil slicks. She closed her eyes, shutting out the dim light of the garage, and placed her palm flat against the valve cover. The vibrations traveled up her arm, a chaotic symphony of misfires and struggles. It wasn't just metal to her, it was a circulatory system. She could feel the stuttering heartbeat of the fuel pump, the shallow breath of the intake. She didn't just hear the problem, she visualized it. A tiny hairline crack in an aging vacuum hose, tucked away behind the manifold, invisible to a casual inspection. A leak so small, so insignificant, that it didn't register on any diagnostic tool. It was a flaw you could only find by feel, by listening to the engine's own story of pain. Her eyes snapped open. She didn't hesitate. Her hand, nimble and sure, snaked into the labyrinth of wires and tubes, her fingers finding the brittle hose by touch alone. A quick, practiced twist, and she had it out. She held it up to the light, pointing to a minuscule fissure that looked like a scratch. 5 minutes later, with a new hose clamped in place, she turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, not with a cough, but with a deep, steady purr. It was the sound of health, the sound of a problem solved. Old Man Hemlock, who had been watching from the doorway with skeptical eyes, let out a low whistle. "I'll be damned," he muttered, shaking his head. 3 shops, $1,000, and they couldn't find a $2 problem. "You're a witch, Maya Lee, a bona fide engine witch." Maya offered a small, tired smile. "Just listen to what they're trying to tell you, Mr. Hemlock. That's all." He counted out a handful of crumpled bills into her palm. "It wasn't much, but it was fair. You keep the change, kid. You earned it." She nodded her thanks, her gaze fixed on the money. As soon as Hemlock's truck rumbled out of the garage, the smile vanished from her face. She walked over to her cluttered workbench, a space dominated by a heavy-duty vise and neatly arranged rows of well-worn wrenches. Taped to the wall was a white envelope with a single grim word written on it in black marker, "Hospital." With a practiced motion, she slid the bills inside, not even bothering to count them. It was just a drop in an ocean of debt. Next to the envelope was a stack of mail, held down by a heavy socket wrench. Most of it was junk, but the top 3 envelopes were different. They bore angry red stamps. "Past due. Final notice." They were wolves at the door, patient and relentless. The city for property taxes on the garage. The utility company threatening to cut the power. The medical supply company for her father's last shipment of medication. Her father, the Lee of Lee & Son. He was the reason for all of this, for the sleepless nights, for the constant, grinding pressure. He was resting in a clean, quiet room in a long-term care facility across town. His world shrunk to a bed, a window, and the hiss of an oxygen machine that kept his damaged lungs working. Years of breathing in the fumes of this very garage, the same ones Maya now considered the smell of home, had betrayed him, leaving him with a chronic respiratory illness that had stolen his strength and his future. The landline phone on her desk, a rotary model that was even older than she was, suddenly rang, its shrill, metallic jangle cutting through the quiet garage. She knew who it was before she picked up. "Lee Mechanical," she answered, her voice flat. "Maya? It's Sarah, from the facility." The nurse's voice was gentle, which was always a bad sign. "We were just reviewing your father's chart. His SpO2 levels have been dipping again at night. Dr. Evans really thinks we should upgrade him to a more powerful oxygen concentrator." Maya closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against the cool brick wall. She already knew what came after that sentence. "And his current one isn't covered anymore," she stated, the words leaving a bitter taste. "The new model isn't—" "No," Sarah said apologetically. "I'm so sorry, honey. I know you're doing your best. I can try to file for an extension, but—" "Don't worry about it, Sarah," Maya interrupted, forcing a strength she didn't feel into her voice. "I'll figure it out, I always do." She hung up the phone and stood there for a long moment, the silence of the garage pressing in on her. "I always do." The words echoed in her mind, hollow and false. For how much longer? Her gaze fell upon a framed photograph on the corner of the desk, its glass clouded with a fine layer of dust. It was of her and her father, taken 10 years ago. He was broad-shouldered and laughing, his arm wrapped tightly around a teenage Maya, both of them covered in grease, standing proudly in front of a classic Mustang they had just finished restoring. His eyes, in the photo, were full of life and pride. Pride in their work, pride in his daughter. Now, that pride was another debt she couldn't seem to pay. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows through the garage door, Maya walked over to the old sign, Lee and Son. She traced the letters of the word son with her finger, feeling the weight of the name, the legacy, the lie. She had her father's gift, his talent magnified tenfold. She had his hands, his work ethic, his love for the intricate dance of pistons and gears. But she didn't have his luck. She was a master of fixing broken things, a witch who could coax life back into dying metal. Yet she was powerless to fix the one thing that mattered most. She was drowning, and the shore was getting further and further away with every red stamp bill, every apologetic phone call, every shallow breath her father took. She picked up a rag and began to wipe down her tools, the familiar, methodical motion a small comfort in the overwhelming chaos of her life. She was one bad month, one major repair, one more medical emergency away from losing it all. The garage, her home, her father. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford, a part she no longer knew how to order. Tonight, the garage didn't smell like home. It smelled like failure. And in the growing darkness, Maya Lee felt utterly and completely alone. Miles away from the scent of oil and gasoline, the air in Arthur Harrison's penthouse was sterile, silent, and cold. It was the processed air of a tomb, meticulously filtered and climate-controlled, stripped of any character or life. His home, occupying the entire top floor of a glass and steel skyscraper, offered a breathtaking 360-degree view of the city and the glittering coastline. But Arthur rarely looked at the city. His attention was fixed on one specific point in the distance, the marina. His world was one of muted colors, charcoal gray, polished chrome, stark white. There were no photographs on the marble walls, no books on the shelves, no clutter on the vast, empty surfaces. It was the home of a man who had systematically erased any evidence of a life lived, curating an existence as pristine and empty as a museum gallery after hours. He was a king in a silent castle, surrounded by unimaginable wealth and suffocating solitude. He ignored the persistent blinking light on his office intercom, a summons from a business empire he had built from scratch, but now found profoundly uninteresting. Instead, he stood before a powerful, brass and mahogany telescope pointed permanently southeast. He adjusted the focus, the finely machined gears turning with a soft, expensive whir. The lens zoomed past the lesser boats, the modern speedsters, the ostentatious catamarans, until it found her. The Serenity. She was a masterpiece of a bygone era. A 70-foot vintage motor yacht, her lines were elegant and timeless. Her hull a deep, lustrous navy blue, her wooden decks gleaming like honey in the afternoon sun. But through the powerful lens, Arthur could see the stillness. There was no life aboard, no crew polishing the brass, no gentle plume of exhaust from her stern. She was a beautiful, silent monument, and her silence was a physical weight on his own heart. An hour later, he was no longer observing from his lonely tower. He was standing on the deck of the Serenity, his tailored suit looking starkly out of place against the backdrop of the working marina. The scent of salt and sea was a welcome change from his sterile apartment, but it did little to soothe the cold knot of frustration in his stomach. Before him stood Vince, the lead engineer from Oceanic Precision, the most expensive and highly regarded marine mechanics on the coast. Vince had the slick, unearned confidence of a man who believed technology could solve any problem. He held a tablet, swiping through diagnostic charts that were meaningless to Arthur. "As you can see, Mr. Harrison," Vince said, his tone a practiced blend of respect and condescension, "the engine's core metrics are a ghost town. We've scoped the cylinders, replaced the entire fuel delivery system, and run a full spectrum analysis on the ignition. Nothing. The problem is systemic. It's metal fatigue, it's age. Frankly, she's a dinosaur." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I did not hire you for a history lesson. I hired you to make it run." Vince gave a sympathetic, patronizing smile. "And we would love to, but sometimes you have to know when to let go of the past. We can install a brand new, fuel-injected V12 twin-turbo. It would be quieter, more efficient, more powerful. We could have it done in 2 weeks. It would make this classic boat better than new." The words struck Arthur like a physical blow. Quieter, more efficient, better than new. Vince didn't understand. He couldn't understand. He saw the engine as a component, a piece of machinery to be replaced. He didn't see the soul. "That," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "is not an option. That engine is the heart of this boat. Its sound is the sound of this boat. Replacing it would be like replacing my own wife's laugh with a recording." Vince's smile faltered. He was a mechanic, not a therapist. He had no protocol for this. "Sir, with all due respect, that's a little sentimental," Arthur finished for him. "Perhaps, but it is my sentiment, and it is my boat. Your services are no longer required." He turned his back on Vince, a clear dismissal. He heard the man mutter something to his subordinate about rich eccentrics before their footsteps retreated down the gangplank. Alone, Arthur stood on the deck, the silence now more profound than ever. The other mechanics had said the same thing. They had all poked and prodded, connected their laptops, and shaken their heads in defeat before presenting him with a glossy brochure for a new engine. They were mechanics of replacement, not restoration. They had lost the art of listening. He walked to the helm, his hand tracing the polished mahogany of the ship's wheel. His fingers found a small rectangular brass plaque, its corners worn smooth from years of being touched. The engraving was simple, elegant script. "For my Arthur, may you always find your serenity, Eleanor." He closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the boat was no longer silent. The memory was so vivid, it was almost a haunting. He is standing in this exact spot, the sun warm on his face, the sea spraying a fine mist into the air. The deep, throaty hum of the engine is a constant, reassuring presence beneath his feet. It's a unique sound, a complex harmony of power and grace that its creator, a long-dead Italian artisan, had referred to as its voce, its voice. Eleanor comes up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. She smells of salt and her favorite lavender perfume. She rests her chin on his shoulder, her laughter bright and effortless as a seagull swoops low over the wake. "It's singing our song, isn't it?" she says, her voice full of a joy so pure it almost hurts to remember. He leans his head back against hers. "It always does when you're here." The memory dissolved, leaving behind the cold, hard reality of the present, the silence, the emptiness. Eleanor had loved this boat, but she had adored its engine. She had commissioned it herself, a surprise for his 50th birthday, calling it her mechanical symphony. It was the last great gift she had given him before the illness took her, silencing her own laughter forever. For 5 years after her passing, he hadn't been able to set foot on the Serenity. It was too much. But as the raw edges of grief softened into a chronic ache, he found that the boat was his only true connection left to her. He didn't want to sail it. He just wanted to hear its voice again. He wanted to sit on the deck, close his eyes, and listen to the song they had shared. But the song was gone. The engine had died 6 months ago, suddenly and without explanation. And with its silence, the last echo of Eleanor's presence in his life had vanished. A figure appeared at the end of the dock, walking towards him. It was the marina manager, a man named Henderson, whose face was etched with the anxiety of someone dealing with a very wealthy, very unhappy client. "Mr. Harrison," Henderson began, wringing his hands. "I saw the Oceanic team leaving. Any luck?" "They are incompetent," Arthur stated flatly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, like all the others. "Sir, I've called everyone. Every certified, gold-plated, five-star marine engineer from here to San Diego. They've all said the same thing. The engine is a museum piece. They can't get parts. They don't understand its design." Arthur turned to face him, his eyes like chips of ice. "Then find someone who does. Find someone who doesn't need a computer to tell them how a machine feels. Find a craftsman, not a technician. I don't care who they are or where they come from. I don't care what it costs. Just find them." Henderson looked defeated. He was about to apologize and retreat when a younger dockhand, who had been coiling ropes nearby, hesitantly approached. "Excuse me, Mr. Henderson." "Sir?" the young man stammered, intimidated by Arthur's presence. "What is it, Ben?" Henderson asked, annoyed by the interruption. "It's just, there's this whisper. A story." "It might be nothing," Ben said, "but my uncle, he's the caretaker for the old lighthouse on the point. The generator out there is ancient, hasn't worked in 20 years. The Coast Guard said to scrap it. But last year, it broke down for good. He called this person a mechanic from the other side of town. A girl, I think. She came out, spent a day just listening to it. And she fixed it. Uncle swore she has magic hands." Henderson looked appalled at the thought. "A girl? From some back alley garage? For Mr. Harrison's custom yacht? Don't be ridiculous, Ben." But Arthur Harrison had heard. He turned his full attention to the young dockhand, his expression unreadable. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than grief and frustration stirred within him. It was a faint, almost imperceptible spark of curiosity. The experts had failed. The technology had failed. The money had failed. A whisper and a story about magic hands were all he had left. "This girl," Arthur said, his voice cutting through the air. "Does she have a name?" Panic had a distinct, coppery taste, and it was flooding the mouth of marina manager Howard Henderson. He sat in his small, tidy office, the panoramic window offering a perfect view of his problem. The sleek, silent form of the Serenity docked in the VIP slip. He loosened his tie for the third time in 10 minutes. On his desk, his pristine Rolodex lay open, a graveyard of failed attempts. Every name in it, from San Diego to Santa Barbara, had been called. The answers had ranged from a polite, "It's impossible," to a derisive laugh. Arthur Harrison was not a man who accepted the word impossible. He was a man who owned marinas, not just rented slips in them. Henderson's career, he was certain, was tethered to the fate of that boat's engine. He looked at the crumpled cocktail napkin on his desk, the only tangible result of his conversation with the dockhand, Ben. On it, scrawled in grease pencil, were 3 words: Lee and Son Mechanical. There was no address, just a phone number. It felt like grasping at smoke. Ben's story about a magic mechanic who fixed an old lighthouse generator was the kind of dockside folklore he usually dismissed out of hand. But today, folklore was all he had left. With a sigh that surrendered the last of his pride, he picked up his phone and dialed the number, half expecting it to be disconnected. After 4 rings, just as he was about to hang up, a woman's voice answered, clipped and professional, "Lee Mechanical." "Yes, hello," Henderson started, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "My name is Howard Henderson. I'm the manager at the Bayside Marina. I'm calling about a potential consultation on a vintage marine engine." There was a pause on the other end. "We don't typically do house calls, Mr. Henderson, and we're not marine specialists." "I am aware of that," Henderson said, the desperation leaking into his voice. "Believe me, I have exhausted the specialists. This is a unique situation. A custom-built engine in a classic yacht. No one can get it started." He decided to play his only card. "The owner is prepared to be extremely generous. We would pay a premium consultation fee just for you to look at it. $500. Non-refundable. whether you can fix it or not. The silence on the other end stretched for a full 10 seconds. Henderson could hear the faint sound of a wrench clattering against concrete. He held his breath. In the cool, dusty air of the garage, Maya froze, the wrench slipping from her grasp. $500. The number echoed in the quiet space, impossibly large. It was the exact amount the nurse had quoted for the down payment on the new oxygen concentrator. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a lifeline thrown into the dark. A yacht. A billionaire. It sounded like a prank, a cruel joke aimed at a person on their last financial leg. But the man's voice didn't sound like he was joking. It sounded like he was drowning. It was a sound Maya knew all too well. "What's the address?" she heard herself say, her voice betraying none of the turmoil in her chest. After hanging up, she stood motionless, the phone's receiver cold in her hand. This was insane. The world of yacht basins and billionaire owners was as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. They would take one look at her faded overalls and her calloused hands, and they would laugh her right back to her side of town. But then, the image of her father's tired face, the sound of his labored breathing, pushed aside the doubt. Fear was a luxury. Pride was a luxury. $500 was not. It was a necessity. It was a chance for her father to breathe a little easier. For that, she would face a whole marina full of laughter. She walked over to her old, battered pickup truck. Its official color had been blue a decade ago, but it was now a patchwork of primer gray, rust, and mismatched paint, earning it the name Patches. It was ugly and loud, but she knew its every quirk and ailment. She had rebuilt its engine twice with her own hands. It was as much a part of her as her tools. She grabbed her main toolbox, a heavy steel case filled, not with gleaming new equipment, but with the worn, familiar shapes of her father's wrenches and her own custom-made instruments. They fit her hand like they were extensions of her own body. The drive to the coast was a journey across a border. The landscape of cracked pavement, chain-link fences, and industrial warehouses slowly gave way to palm-lined boulevards, boutique shops, and sprawling houses with ocean views. When she pulled up to the security gate of the marina, the guard looked from her truck to his clipboard and back again, his expression a mask of disbelief. "Maya Lee?" he asked, as if the name itself tasted strange. "For Mr. Harrison?" "That's me," she said, her hands tightening on the steering wheel. He waved her through with a shrug, and she drove Patches slowly down the pristine cobblestone path, feeling 100 pairs of eyes on her. The truck's rumbling engine sounded like a barbarian's war cry in this temple of quiet wealth. She passed rows of gleaming Lamborghinis and Bentleys, parked at jaunty angles as if their owners couldn't be bothered with lines. She finally found a parking spot at the far end of the lot, nestled between a landscaping truck and a dumpster. It felt like where she belonged. As she got out and hefted her heavy toolbox, the scene before her was intimidating. The sun glinted off the white fiberglass of dozens of multi-million-dollar boats, their masts clanging a gentle, metallic rhythm in the sea breeze. Well-dressed people in deck shoes and sunglasses strolled along the docks, laughing softly. And there, standing near the largest slip, was a group of men in crisp, matching uniforms, their company logo, Oceanic Precision, emblazoned on their chests. Leading them was a man with slick-back hair and a smug expression she recognized instantly from magazine articles about high-end marine tech. It was Vince. He saw her approaching, his eyes scanning her old truck, her worn overalls, and the heavy toolbox in her hand. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for his team to hear. "Looks like Henderson is really scraping the bottom of the barrel. Did you come to wash the decks, little one?" His crew snickered. Maya felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks, but she pushed it down. She had faced down engines that had chewed up and spit out men like him. His ego was just another type of noise, and she was an expert at filtering out noise. She walked past them without a word, her focus on the task ahead. But Vince stepped into her path, blocking her way. "Whoa there," he said, holding up a hand. "This is a high-tech zone. I don't see any diagnostic tablets or digital manometers. You can't fix a modern marvel with a box of relics from your granddad's shed." Maya stopped and looked at him. She didn't look at his smug face, but at his hands. They were clean, the nails perfectly manicured. They were the hands of a salesman, not a mechanic. Then she looked down at her own hands, the ingrained grease in the lines of her palms, the calluses on her fingertips, the scar on her knuckle from a slipped wrench. These were the hands of a listener. Sometimes, she said, her voice quiet but clear, the old ways are the only ways that remember the old songs. Her unexpected response seemed to catch him off guard. Before he could formulate another insult, Henderson came scurrying down the dock, his face a mixture of relief and sheer terror. "Miss Lee, you're here. Thank you for coming," he said, practically wringing his hands. "Please don't mind them. The Serenity is this way." He led her away from Vince's sneering crew towards the magnificent yacht that was the cause of all this trouble. As they approached, Maya's apprehension began to melt away, replaced by a feeling of profound professional respect. She wasn't looking at a rich man's toy, she was looking at a work of art. The boat's design was flawless, its craftsmanship evident in every joint and curve. It had character, it had history, and it had a problem no one could solve. She stepped onto the gangplank, the heavy toolbox feeling suddenly lighter in her hand. This was her world now, not the sneering mechanics or the imposing wealth. The boat, the puzzle, the silent engine waiting in the dark. For the first time all day, Maya felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a very long time. The thrill of the impossible. The moment Maya's worn work boots touched the polished teak deck of the Serenity, the world seemed to quiet. The jeers of Vince's crew faded into the background, and the oppressive weight of the marina's opulence lessened. Here, on the deck of this magnificent vessel, there was only the gentle rocking of the water, the distant cry of a gull, and the challenge that lay ahead. Henderson, the nervous marina manager, scurried ahead of her. "He's in the main salon, Miss Lee. Mr. Harrison, he's eager to meet you." The man's attempt at a positive spin was comically transparent. Eager was clearly a euphemism for impatient and losing hope. Maya barely heard him. Her mechanic's eye was already taking in the details around her, the flawless brass cleats, the perfectly coiled ropes, the gleaming varnish on the handrails. This boat wasn't just maintained. It was cherished. It was loved. That told her more than any diagnostic report ever could. A loved machine always had a reason to run. Henderson led her to a set of wide glass doors, which slid open to reveal the main salon. And there, standing with his back to them, was the man himself, Arthur Harrison. He was staring out at the ocean, a tall, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that seemed more appropriate for a boardroom than a boat deck. He didn't turn as they entered. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by the faint, rhythmic clanging from a distant mast. "Mr. Harrison," Henderson said, his voice trembling slightly. "This is Maya Lee, the mechanic I told you about." Arthur Harrison turned slowly, and Maya felt the full force of his presence. His hair was silver, his face was a mask of aristocratic lines, but his eyes were what held her. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they held no warmth, only a deep, weary intelligence and an almost palpable grief. His gaze swept over her, from her steel-toed boots to the grease smudge on her cheek, lingering for a moment on the heavy, old-fashioned toolbox in her hand. It wasn't a look of contempt, like Vince's had been. It was one of cold, clinical assessment. He was weighing and measuring her, and she could feel herself being found wanting. "You are the engine witch from the lighthouse," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and controlled, but with an edge of steel. "I'm a mechanic," Maya corrected him gently, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "The others," he gestured vaguely towards the shore, dismissing all the previous experts with a wave of his hand, brought teams. They brought laptops, spectrum analyzers, and endoscopes. "You have brought a box of wrenches." Maya set the heavy toolbox down on the pristine deck with a soft, deliberate thud. "Computers are good for finding data, Mr. Harrison, but they can't find a machine's spirit. Sometimes you have to use tools that have a little bit of a soul themselves. A flicker of something surprise, intrigue, passed through his cold blue eyes before the mask snapped back into place. He clearly wasn't a man who trafficked in concepts like soul or spirit. "Show me the engine," Maya said, shifting the focus back to familiar territory. Harrison gave a curt nod and led the way. He moved through the yacht's luxurious interior with a grim purpose, past a galley kitchen that was more state-of-the-art than most restaurants, and a salon with plush leather sofas. He didn't seem to see any of it. His destination was a heavy, soundproof door near the stern. He pulled it open, revealing a steep set of metal stairs leading down into the heart of the vessel. As Maya descended, the air changed. It grew warmer, thick with the smell of diesel, salt, and cold metal. And then she saw it. She stopped on the last step, her breath catching in her throat. The engine room was immaculate, the bilge clean and dry, the chrome components gleaming under the bright utility lights. But the engine itself was the star. It wasn't the typical block of painted metal she was used to. It was a work of industrial art. Two banks of 6 cylinders were arranged in a perfect V, with polished brass intake manifolds and braided steel hoses. It was a custom-built marvel from an era when engineers were also artists. A smile, genuine and unbidden, touched Maya's lips for the first time that day. This wasn't a patient. This was a masterpiece. "She's beautiful," she breathed, her voice filled with a reverence that was completely lost on Henderson, but not, perhaps, on Harrison, who stood silently at the top of the stairs, watching her. She stepped off the ladder and approached the engine block. She didn't open her toolbox. Instead, she did what she always did. She laid her palm flat against the cold, massive engine block, just as she had with the pickup truck hours earlier. She closed her eyes. She wasn't a witch. She wasn't magic. Her gift was a hyper-focused empathy, a deep, intuitive understanding of mechanical systems born from a lifetime of study and an innate talent she couldn't explain. As her palm rested on the metal, she wasn't looking for a single broken part. She was trying to feel the entire system as a whole, the flow, the balance, the story. She could feel the ghosts of the other mechanics' attempts. The new fuel injectors felt wrong, their modern precision slightly out of sync with the rest of the engine's analog nature. The diagnostic ports they had installed were like ugly scars on a perfect sculpture. They had tried to force it to speak their language, the language of binary code and digital readouts. They had never bothered to learn its native tongue. Arthur Harrison's voice cut through her concentration. "What are you doing?" he asked from the doorway, his impatience evident. "Can you fix it or not?" Maya opened her eyes, her hand still resting on the engine. She turned to look up at him. "I don't know yet," she answered honestly. "I haven't asked it the right questions." Henderson, standing behind Harrison, looked like he was about to have an aneurysm. He had brought a mechanic who wanted to talk to the engine. But Harrison's reaction was different. He descended the stairs and stood on the other side of the engine, his expensive leather shoes looking absurdly out of place on the diamond plate floor. He looked at her, then at the engine, then back at her. "What questions does one ask a dead machine, Miss Lee?" "You ask it why it stopped singing," Maya replied simply. "You ask it what part of its story is finished." She ran her hand along one of the brass manifolds. This engine wasn't built for efficiency, was it? It was built for a feeling, for a sound. Harrison was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the spot her hand had just touched. He seemed to be looking at a memory, not a piece of metal. "Its creator called it sound the voce," he said softly, almost to himself. "The voice." Maya nodded slowly. "Then I need to find its voice. The other mechanics, they tried to give it a transplant. They wanted to force it to shout. But I think," she paused, patting the engine block gently, "it just needs to be taught how to whisper again." This was it. The moment of truth. She had laid out her unorthodox philosophy. No jargon, no promises of a quick fix. Just an honest, if unusual, assessment. He would either throw her off his boat or he would give her a chance. Arthur Harrison studied her face, his own expression unreadable. He saw no cunning, no attempt to hustle him. He saw only a deep, earnest seriousness in her dark eyes. He saw the grease under her fingernails and the calm confidence in her posture. He had been surrounded by men who promised him the world and delivered nothing. This young woman promised nothing but her attention. It was the most intriguing offer he'd had in months. "The marina manager informed me that you fixed the generator at the old lighthouse," he stated. "I did. They said it was irreparable." "They were wrong," Maya said. A long silence stretched between them, thick with the smell of oil and the weight of expectation. Finally, Harrison gave a single, decisive nod. "Very well, Miss Lee," he said, his voice retaining its authority but losing some of its icy edge. "Listen to your heart's content. Find its voice." He turned to leave, then paused at the foot of the stairs. "You have 48 hours. As he ascended the steps, Leaving Maya alone with the silent giant, she felt a profound sense of both terror and elation. 48 hours. It was an impossible timeline. But as she looked at the beautiful, complex puzzle before her, she knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She finally knelt and opened her toolbox. The familiar, comforting click of the latches was the real beginning of her conversation with the Serenity. The 48-hour clock had begun. For Maya Lee, the immaculate, silent engine room of the Serenity became her entire world. The concept of time blurred, marked not by the sun's rise and fall, but by a methodical, almost ritualistic process of elimination. Arthur Harrison had given her a deadline. The engine had given her a puzzle. Only one of them mattered. She began not with a wrench, but with a pen and a spiral-bound notebook. For the first 3 hours, she didn't touch a single component. She simply observed. She sketched the engine from every angle, her pencil tracing the intricate paths of the fuel lines, the complex web of the vintage wiring harness, the unique architecture of the dual intake manifolds. She wasn't just drawing a machine, she was creating a map of its circulatory and nervous systems. This was her father's first lesson. Never try to fix a machine until you understand its purpose. As she worked, she undid the repairs of the previous mechanics. The new, ill-fitting fuel injectors were the first to go. She carefully removed them, her fingers sensing the slight difference in the threading, the almost imperceptible mismatch that could create a vacuum leak so subtle it would be invisible to a pressure gauge. She replaced them with the engine's original, cleaned injectors she found, discarded in a box of old parts. Next, she traced every wire by hand, from the ignition coil to the distributor. Her calloused fingertips were more sensitive than any multimeter for finding brittle insulation or a corroded connection point. She felt for inconsistencies, for spots that felt too stiff or too soft, telltale signs of age and decay that a simple continuity test would miss. The work was slow, painstaking, and utterly absorbing. It was a form of meditation. The sun set, and the engine room was cast in the steady, unwavering glow of its utility lights. Henderson, the marina manager, appeared at the top of the stairs with a bottle of water and a sandwich in a plastic container. "Find anything yet?" he asked, his voice echoing with nervous hope. Maya looked up from where she was meticulously cleaning a spark plug with a wire brush. "It's telling me stories," she said, holding up the plug. The insulator was slightly discolored, a faint brownish tint. "This one says the fuel mixture was too lean. The computer jockeys probably adjusted it to modern specs, but this old girl was built to run rich. She needs more fuel to be happy." Henderson just nodded, not understanding a word but reassured by her confidence. He left the food and water on the top step and retreated, leaving her to her vigil. By the 24-hour mark, Maya was running on caffeine and pure stubbornness. She had systematically tested every standard component. The fuel pump was strong, the ignition coil produced a fat, blue spark, the compression in every cylinder was perfect. By all conventional logic, the engine should run. But it didn't. It wouldn't even turn over. It remained stubbornly, defiantly silent. Doubt, cold and unwelcome, began to creep into the edges of her concentration. What if Vince was right? What if it's just old and tired? She thought of her father in his hospital bed, of the $500 consultation fee that she had already mentally spent on his care. The pressure mounted, a physical weight on her shoulders. It was during this moment of near despair that Vince himself appeared, strolling down the dock as if on a casual inspection. He peered down the engine room hatch, a smug grin on his face. "Still talking to your patient, doctor." "Frankenstein?" he mocked. "Have you tried asking it nicely to start?" "I hear they like that." Maya ignored him, her jaw tight, focusing on tightening a bolt on the water pump. "Give it up, kid," Vince continued, leaning against the doorway. "You're out of your league, mister. Harrison is a sentimental old fool, but even he will realize soon that you can't raise the dead. We've already quoted him on a new twin-turbo install. That's the future, not this relic." The word relic struck a nerve. She looked at the beautiful, powerful machine before her, a testament to craftsmanship and design, and felt a fierce surge of protectiveness. "This relic has more character in one piston than your entire plastic and chrome catalog." She shot back, not looking up. "Go sell your soulless machines to someone who doesn't know any better." Vince's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of anger. "You'll be gone by morning," he sneered, before turning and walking away. His words, meant to discourage, had the opposite effect. They reignited her resolve. This was no longer just about the money or her father. It was about respect. It was about proving that the old ways, the ways of listening and understanding, still had value in a world obsessed with replacement. Feeling defeated by the main components, she shifted her strategy. She needed a new perspective. Remembering her brief conversation with Harrison, she decided to search the cabin for anything that could give her a clue. In the main salon, tucked away in a drawer beneath a navigation chart table, she found it. It was a leather-bound logbook. Not a technical manual, but a personal journal. The inside cover read, in elegant flowing script, "The Serenity's Adventures." The handwriting belonged to a woman, Eleanor. Maya sat on the plush salon sofa and began to read. Most of it was travel entries, descriptions of sunsets in Catalina, encounters with dolphins off the coast, a celebration for a wedding anniversary. But woven throughout the narrative were loving, almost anthropomorphic descriptions of the boat itself. And more importantly, its engine. One entry, dated nearly 15 years prior, jumped out at her. The 12th of October. A bit of a scare today. We hit some rough seas on the way back from the islands, and the engine started to cough and sputter. Arthur was worried, but I remembered what Mr. Rossi, its creator, told us. He said the engine had a passionate Italian heart, and sometimes, after being pushed, it gets temperamental. He said it needed to rest, but not for too long. He said its soul was in a tiny part he made himself, a little valve that regulated its breathing. He told us, "It does not like to be cold." Another entry, a few years later, June sank. The engine hummed our song all the way to Newport. It only truly sings after a long, hard run, once it's completely warmed through. It's like it has to warm up its heart before it can really perform. Maya's mind raced. A tiny part he made himself. A little valve that regulated its breathing. It does not like to be cold. She slammed the logbook shut and scrambled back down into the engine room, her exhaustion replaced by a jolt of adrenaline. She wasn't looking for a broken part anymore. She was looking for a custom part, a temperamental part, a part with a soul. Her eyes scanned the engine, but this time with new information. She ignored the major systems and focused on the periphery, the small, seemingly insignificant components. And then she saw it. Tucked away on the side of the fuel distribution block was a small, cylindrical brass object, no bigger than her thumb. It wasn't on any of the standard engine diagrams she had studied. It had no part number. It was connected to a series of tiny fuel lines. It was a custom-made mechanical fuel regulator. The other mechanics, with their computer-first approach, would have dismissed it as a non-standard curiosity, if they even noticed it at all. This had to be it. Mr. Rossi's little valve. With the delicate touch of a surgeon, she used a pair of specialized wrenches to carefully disconnect it. It came free with a soft click. She held it in her palm. It felt heavier than it should. She gave it a gentle shake. Instead of a slight mechanical rattle, she heard nothing. It was seized. It doesn't like to be cold. Years of sitting idle, of the engine being cold, had caused the oils and microscopic fuel deposits inside to congeal, turning into a thick varnish. The tiny spring-loaded piston inside was completely stuck. It wasn't broken. It wasn't worn out. It was just asleep. A deep, stubborn sleep. A wide grin spread across Maya's face. She had found it. She hadn't found a failure of metal or engineering. She had found a failure of understanding. She knew she couldn't just replace it. A part like this didn't exist on any shelf. It had to be restored. It had to be woken up. With less than 10 hours left on her deadline, Maya Lee sat at the small workbench in the corner of the engine room, a high-intensity lamp focused on the tiny brass cylinder in front of her. The vigil was no longer about finding the problem. It was about resurrecting its heart. The world outside the engine room had long since woken up. The sun was high in the sky, casting brilliant, dancing reflections off the water and onto the portholes. The marina was bustling with the sounds of a new day, the cheerful greetings of boat owners, the rumble of service carts, the distant laughter of children on the small beach. But inside the hull of the Serenity, there was only a focused, reverent silence, punctuated by the faint, rhythmic click and scrape of metal on metal. Maya was no longer a mechanic. She was a watchmaker, a surgeon. The small brass cylinder Mr. Rossi's temperamental heart lay disassembled on a clean white rag on her workbench. Its components were minuscule: a tiny, spring-loaded piston, a set of hair-thin shims, and a needle valve so fine it looked like it could be snapped by a harsh breath. She had spent the last several hours painstakingly soaking the parts in a specialized solvent, gently coaxing them apart without scratching the precision-milled brass. The congealed varnish of old fuel had been as stubborn as ancient amber, but with patience and a set of dental picks, she had scraped away the last of the residue. Now, the components lay gleaming under the bright lamp, clean and ready. The task now was not just reassembly, it was calibration. The shims, each no thicker than a piece of paper, controlled the tension on the spring, which in turn controlled the flow of fuel. This was the engine's breath that Eleanor had written about. Too tight, and it would suffocate. Too loose, and it would hyperventilate. It had to be perfect. She worked with a magnifying glass mounted on a stand, her breathing slow and even. This was the art of it, the part that could never be programmed into a computer. It was a calibration of feel, of intuition honed by 1,000 other repairs. She added one shim, then another, feeling the subtle change in the spring's tension with her fingertips. It was in this state of deep concentration that Arthur Harrison found her. He had descended the stairs so quietly that she didn't notice him until he spoke, his voice making her jump. "Your 48 hours are nearly up, Miss Lee." Maya looked up, startled, blinking to refocus her eyes from the microscopic world of the valve to the man standing before her. He looked tired, his suit slightly rumpled, as if he hadn't slept. The cold mask of the billionaire had been replaced by the weary face of a man at the end of his rope. He had come to deliver the final verdict. "I know," she said, her voice calm. She gestured to the tiny, gleaming parts on the rag. "I found the problem." Harrison stepped closer, peering at the disassembled cylinder. He looked from the tiny components to her focused expression. He didn't see a frantic, last-ditch effort. He saw the quiet confidence of someone who was in complete control. He had expected to find her defeated, ready to pack up her tools. He did not expect to find her performing microsurgery. "That?" he asked, his skepticism evident. "That little thing has kept the most advanced diagnostic teams on the coast stumped for 6 months. They were looking for something broken," Maya explained, carefully picking up the tiny piston with a pair of tweezers. "They weren't looking for something that was asleep. This is a custom fuel regulator. It was seized solid by old fuel residue. It wasn't allowing any fuel to pass into the intake manifold at low RPMs. The engine couldn't get its first breath to start." She began to reassemble the valve, her movements precise and economical. "Your wife's logbook was the key," she added softly. The mention of Eleanor's name hung in the air between them. Harrison's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing for a fraction of a second. "Her logbook?" She wrote that its creator said it had a passionate heart that didn't like to be cold. "It was a clue. It told me I was looking for a non-standard part that was sensitive to temperature and time. Something with a personality." Harrison watched, mesmerized, as she finished the assembly. The tiny cylinder was whole again. He had watched teams of men with expensive equipment attack this engine with brute force and complex algorithms. They had treated it like an adversary. This young woman was treating it with a gentleness and respect he hadn't seen since Eleanor. With the regulator reassembled, Maya moved back to the engine block. She carefully threaded the part back into its housing, her fingers moving with a familiar, practiced grace. She reconnected the fuel lines, tightening the fittings just enough, a sense of rightness in her hands. Everything was back in its place. The original parts were restored, the systems were balanced. It was time. She wiped her hands on a clean rag and turned to face him fully. The air in the small room was thick with anticipation. This was the moment. All the hours of work, all the intuition, all the history came down to this. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's see if she wants to wake up." She moved to the starter controls on the engine room wall, her hand hovering over the ignition key. She took a deep, steadying breath and looked at Harrison. His face was a stone mask, but she could see the pulse beating in his throat. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Maya turned the key. For a long second, there was only the familiar, disappointing silence, followed by the low whir of the starter motor turning fruitlessly. A wave of despair washed over Maya. Number. Not now. Henderson, who had appeared at the top of the stairs, let out a soft groan of defeat. But then, something different happened. A cough. A single, deep, guttural cough from the heart of the engine, a sound of life where there had been none. It was followed by a sputter, a chugging gasp as the fuel, for the first time in months, was drawn into the cylinders. And then, it happened. The sputter caught, smoothed out, and erupted into a low, rumbling growl. It was not the cacophony of a struggling machine, but a deep, powerful, and profoundly resonant hum. The sound filled the small room, vibrating through the floor plates, up through the soles of their feet, and into their chests. It was the sound of 12 synchronized pistons dancing in perfect harmony. The sound of life, the sound of memory. The voch. Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across her face. But her triumph was secondary to the reaction of the man standing across from her. Arthur Harrison's face had lost all its composure. The mask had not just cracked, it had shattered. His eyes were wide, fixed on the living, breathing machine before him, as if seeing a ghost. The color had drained from his face, only to be replaced by a flush of raw, overwhelming emotion. This wasn't just the sound of an engine. It was the soundtrack to the best years of his life. It was the hum beneath the deck on his honeymoon. It was the roar of acceleration as Eleanor laughed, her hair flying in the wind. It was the soft, rhythmic purr that had lulled them to sleep, anchored in a quiet cove. Every note, every vibration was a key unlocking 1,000 memories he had thought were lost to silence forever. A single tear escaped his eye and traced a path down his cheek. He made no move to wipe it away. He was frozen, listening, as the engine settled into a smooth, confident idle, its unique voice filling the space where grief and silence had lived for so long. He looked at Maya, his eyes full of a dawning, wondrous understanding. She hadn't just fixed a machine. She hadn't just won a bet or earned a fee. She had, through her patience, her strange intuition, and her respect for the past, performed an act of resurrection. "That's it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "That's her song." They stood on the deck of the Serenity as the sun began its slow, majestic descent into the Pacific. The sky was ablaze with strokes of orange, purple, and gold, a spectacle of natural grandeur that for the first time in years, Arthur Harrison was actually seeing. Below them, the engine maintained its steady, reassuring hum, a warm, living pulse that had fundamentally altered the character of the evening from one of somber silence to one of serene contentment. The air was soft and warm. Maya had cleaned her hands as best she could with a shop rag, but the faint scent of solvent and oil still clung to her. She stood awkwardly near the railing, feeling out of place amidst the quiet luxury of the sunset cruise she had inadvertently been invited on. After the engine had started, Harrison had insisted, his voice still thick with emotion, that they take the boat out, just beyond the breakwater. "A machine like this isn't meant to be tied to a dock," he had said. "It needs to breathe." Harrison had been mostly quiet during the short voyage, standing at the helm, his hand resting lightly on the ship's wheel. He wasn't steering so much as communing with the vessel, his eyes closed from time to time as if savoring a fine wine. The tense, grief-stricken billionaire who had hired her was gone. In his place was a man who seemed to have found a piece of himself he thought was lost forever. Now, as they drifted gently on the calm water, he finally turned to her. His eyes, though still holding a deep-seated sadness, were clear and direct. The icy wall of his authority had melted away. "I have had armies of men attempt what you accomplished today, Miss Lee," he began, his voice low and steady. "Men with doctorates in engineering, men who run multinational corporations. They all brought their arrogance and their technology, and they all failed." He paused, looking at her with a newfound sense of wonder. "You brought your father's tools and your intuition, and you succeeded. I don't think I fully understand how, but I understand the result." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out something that made Maya's stomach clench, a leather-bound checkbook and a sleek, gold-plated fountain pen. He opened the checkbook on the chart table with a soft snap. "I made you a promise," he said, uncapping the pen. "I told you to name your price. I believe the word I used was anything. And after what you have done today, Anything seems insufficient. He gestured to the blank check with the tip of his pen. Write any number on that line. Solve your problems. Buy a new garage. Buy a fleet of new trucks. Buy a house on the beach next to this one. Whatever you write, I will sign it without question. You have given me back something that is, for all intents and purposes, priceless. It is only fair you receive the same. Maya stared at the blank check. It was a magic wand, a golden ticket, a solution to every single problem that was crushing the life out of her. The number for her father's new oxygen machine flashed in her mind, followed by the towering figure of his total medical debt. The past due notices for the garage, the threatening letters from the city, all of it could be wiped away with a few strokes of a pen. She could secure her father's care for the rest of his life. She could finally sleep at night without the specter of debt haunting her dreams. She could hire a team, expand the business, finally change the sign to Lee and daughter without a trace of irony. Her hand almost twitched to take the pen. It was what anyone would do. It was the logical, sensible, sane thing to do. But then she looked up from the check, and at Arthur Harrison's face, she saw the raw vulnerability there, the unguarded relief of a man who had just been reunited with a ghost. Her gaze drifted past him to the helm, where a small, sun-faded photograph was tucked into the corner of the instrument panel. It was a picture of a younger Harrison, laughing, with his arm around a vibrant, beautiful woman with kind eyes, Eleanor. They were on this very boat, the joy in the photograph so palpable it felt like a third presence on the deck. And in that moment, Maya understood. This wasn't a business transaction, not anymore. To put a number on that check would be to put a price on that photograph. It would be to quantify a man's love for his late wife, to monetize his grief and his relief. It would reduce the miraculous revival of the engine's voce to a simple, albeit expensive, repair. It would make her no different from Vince and all the other mechanics who saw only a machine, not a memory. She thought about her own father. She thought about the photograph of him and her, standing proudly by the Mustang they had restored together. What would that memory be worth? If a stranger had helped her retrieve it, what would be the price? There was no number. With a soft breath, she made her choice. Slowly, she reached into the back pocket of her overalls and pulled out her own worn, dog-eared receipt book and a stubby pencil. She rested it on the table next to his pristine checkbook. Licking the tip of the pencil, she began to write. Her movements careful and deliberate. Harrison watched her, a curious expression on his face, assuming she was calculating the enormous figure she was about to demand. When she finished, she tore the sheet cleanly from the book and slid it across the table to him. He picked it up. The paper was simple, with the Lee and Son mechanical letterhead printed at the top. On it, in her clear, practical handwriting, was an itemized list. Specialty engine solvent, $45. Assorted gaskets and seals, $18.50. Labor, 14 hours at $12. HR, garage rate, $168. At the bottom of the page, a final figure was circled twice. Total, $231.50. Arthur Harrison stared at the invoice, then back at Maya, his expression one of utter disbelief. He seemed to think it was a joke, a prelude to the real negotiation. Miss Lee, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly, Mr. Harrison, Maya interrupted him softly but firmly. She gently pushed his checkbook, with the blank check still inside, back towards him. That sound, she said, nodding towards the deck, where the hum was a constant, comforting presence. That specific hum at this specific RPM, it was important to someone, wasn't it? It was a memory. Her memory. She glanced at the photograph of Eleanor. You can't put a price on a memory, sir. It's the most valuable thing we own. You don't owe me for giving you back your boat. The boat was never really broken. She tapped the invoice with her finger. You just owe me for the cleaning supplies and a fair day's work. That's all. The billionaire stared at the simple, handwritten bill for $231.50. He looked at the young woman before him, her face earnest, her eyes clear of any greed or cunning. He saw the grease still etched into the lines of her hands, a testament to the honest labor she had performed. In his life, everyone had always wanted something from him. His time, his influence, his name, and most of all, his money. People presented him with problems so he could provide them with solutions in the form of a check. It was a language he was fluent in. But this This was a language he had forgotten. The language of integrity, of empathy, of a kindness so pure and unconditional it was utterly disarming. This struggling mechanic, who needed the money more than anyone he had ever met, had been offered a blank check, a key to a new life. And she had refused it. She hadn't refused it out of pride or foolishness. She had refused it out of a profound and simple respect for his love for his wife. The final piece of Arthur Harrison's carefully constructed emotional armor crumbled into dust. The single tear from the engine room was joined by others. He didn't try to hide them. He let them fall. They weren't tears of grief, but of something far more potent: gratitude. He slowly picked up the fountain pen, but he didn't sign the blank check. Instead, he reached for his wallet, his movements slow and deliberate. What he did next was not a transaction. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance of a gift he never knew he needed. The sun rose the next morning on a different Arthur Harrison. He woke not to the oppressive silence of his penthouse, but to the memory of a sound, the deep, resonant hum of the Serenity's engine. It was as if a color had been restored to his black and white world. For the first time in 5 years, the grief that had defined his existence was not the first thing he felt upon waking. It had been replaced by a quiet, profound sense of gratitude. He bypassed his usual routine. He didn't turn on the financial news, he didn't check the overseas markets, and he ignored the blinking red light on his intercom that signaled a dozen urgent calls from his global empire. His priorities, for so long anchored to balance sheets and stock tickers, had undergone a seismic shift in the course of a single sunset. He showered, dressed not in his usual armor of a bespoke suit, but in a simple pair of gray trousers and a cashmere sweater. He did not call for his driver. Instead, he took the elevator down to the parking garage, walked past his Rolls-Royce, and got into a modest, black sedan he hadn't driven himself in years. His destination was not his gleaming office tower downtown. It was a place on the other side of the city, a place he had only learned the name of yesterday. The Northwood Long-Term Care Facility was a clean, respectable, but unremarkable building. It was a world away from the private clinics and exclusive wellness retreats Arthur Harrison was familiar with. This was a place of necessity, not luxury, a place funded by insurance battles and desperate family contributions. He walked in, his quiet presence creating a small stir among the nursing staff. He did not announce himself as Arthur Harrison, the billionaire. He walked to the front desk and spoke to the charge nurse, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes. "Good morning," he said, his voice softer than its usual authoritative tone. "I'm here to inquire about one of your residents, a Mr. Robert Lee. I'm a friend of his daughter, Maya." The nurse, Sarah, recognized the name immediately. She looked at this well-dressed, distinguished man with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. Maya's friends, as far as she knew, were gruff mechanics and parts suppliers, not men who looked like they owned the building. "Mr. Lee is resting," she said cautiously. "Is there something I can help you with?" "Yes," Arthur said. "I understand there are some concerns about his respiratory care, about the equipment he requires." Sarah's professional guard went up slightly. "Patient details are confidential, sir." "Of course," Arthur said, nodding. "I'm not asking for his medical records. I'm asking for a meeting with his primary physician, Dr. Evans. I want to understand the full scope of his needs and the very best possible treatment options, irrespective of cost or insurance coverage. Please tell the doctor that my foundation will be handling all associated expenses, effective immediately." Sarah's jaw dropped slightly. "Foundation?" She looked at the man again, a dawning recognition in her eyes. She had seen his picture in the newspaper. This was not just a friend of Maya's. This was the Arthur Harrison. While Harrison was quietly rewriting Robert Lee's future, Maya was dealing with the immediate present. She had driven home from the marina late last night in a daze, the crumpled bills Harrison had insisted on giving her for her invoice tucked safely in her pocket. It was $300, he'd told her, to keep the change as an after-hours premium. She didn't go to sleep. Instead, she went to the 24-hour gourmet market near the marina, a place she had only ever driven past, and used a small portion of the money. She bought a container of rich, slow-simmered beef barley soup, a loaf of fresh sourdough bread, and a small, perfect apple tart. The next morning, she brought the feast to the facility. She found her father awake, sitting up in his bed, looking out the window. The familiar labored hiss of his old oxygen machine filled the small room. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice bright. He turned, a tired smile gracing his thin face. "Maya, girl, you're here early. Brought you something better than the Tuesday mystery meatloaf," she said, unpacking the food. The rich aroma of the soup filled the sterile room. For the next hour, they didn't talk about bills or broken-down cars. She just sat with him, watching him eat. He savored every spoonful of the soup, his eyes closing in appreciation. It was the most animated she had seen him in months. The simple act of providing him with a good meal, a small comfort paid for with honest work, filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a very long time. It wasn't the blank check solution she had dreamed of, but it was real. It was a small victory, and right now, that was enough. She had done the right thing, and there was a quiet strength in that knowledge. She had no idea that just a few floors below them, a far greater victory was being won on her behalf. Arthur Harrison sat in a small, windowless conference room across from Dr. Evans, a harried but dedicated physician. On the table between them were charts and prognoses. "Mr. Lee's condition is chronic," Dr. Evans explained, "but it is manageable. With more advanced respiratory support, physical therapy, and a better nutritional regimen, his quality of life could improve dramatically. We're talking about more mobility, less fatigue, maybe even short walks outside. But his insurance plan, it only covers the bare minimum." "His insurance plan is no longer a factor, doctor," Arthur stated simply. He slid a business card across the table. "This is the director of my personal charitable foundation. He is awaiting your call. You will provide him with a list of everything, and I mean everything that Mr. Lee requires for optimal care. The best equipment, the best therapists, the best specialists. You will spare no expense. The foundation will settle the existing balance with this facility and will cover all future costs in perpetuity. Is that clear?" Dr. Evans stared at the card, then at the man, utterly dumbfounded. He had spent his career fighting with insurance companies over minor procedures. The concept of sparing no expense was so foreign it felt like it belonged in a fairy tale. "Yes, Mr. Harrison," the doctor finally managed to say. Perfectly clear. Arthur's work was not done. After leaving the facility, he made 2 more phone calls from his car. The first was to the managing partner of the top law firm in the city. "David," Arthur said, dispensing with pleasantries, "I need you to look into a small business, Lee and Son Mechanical. I want to know everything. Its assets, its debts, its tax situation. I want you to discreetly and anonymously settle any and all outstanding liabilities it has. Mortgages, taxes, supplier debts, everything. I want it cleared." The second call was to a commercial real estate agent he kept on retainer. "Margaret, do you know the old warehouse district near the Bayside Marina?" "Yes, the rundown part. There's a large, empty warehouse right on the water. The one with the faded Pier 7 import sign on it. I want you to buy it. And I want you to start drawing up plans for a world-class state-of-the-art restoration workshop." He hung up, a strange sense of purpose settling over him. This wasn't charity. Charity was writing a check at a gala and forgetting about it. This was different. This was an investment. It was an investment in integrity, in kindness, in the rare and valuable spirit of a young woman who had shown him that some things were more valuable than money. Maya Lee hadn't just fixed his boat. She had reminded him of the man he was when Eleanor was still alive. A man who understood value beyond the bottom line. He was creating a ripple, starting from the small, honorable acts she had performed on his boat. He had no idea how far it would spread, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt the profound satisfaction of using his immense power not to accumulate more, but to build something good. He was not just paying a debt, he was honoring a gift. The weeks that followed Maya's encounter with the Serenity were a strange mix of the familiar and the surreal. The familiar was the daily grind, the smell of her garage, the feel of a wrench in her hand, the satisfaction of coaxing a stubborn engine back to life. Patches, her old pickup truck, continued its faithful rumbling service. But underneath the surface of this routine, things had subtly changed. A quiet had fallen over her financial life. The angry, red-stamped envelopes simply stopped coming. When she called the utility company to inquire about her past due balance, the automated system informed her she had a credit of $200. Confused, she called the city tax office, expecting an argument, but was told her property taxes were paid in full for the next 2 years. An anonymous benefactor, they said. It was a clerical mystery she couldn't solve. The most profound change, however, was at the long-term care facility. When she visited her father now, the constant, labored hiss of the old oxygen machine was gone. In its place was a new, state-of-the-art concentrator that was so quiet it was barely audible. Her father's color was better, his breathing was deeper, and a physical therapist now came twice a day to work with him. When she asked the head nurse, Sarah, how all this was possible, Sarah just gave her a knowing, conspiratorial wink. "Seems your father has a guardian angel, Maya," she had said, leaving Maya more bewildered than ever. She suspected Arthur Harrison was behind it, but it seemed too grand, too sweeping a gesture for a simple engine repair. She had sent him a thank you note, along with a receipt for the $300 he'd given her, but had heard nothing back. The silence made her think that perhaps he had simply moved on, a billionaire briefly intersecting with her world before disappearing back into his own. She was grateful for the mysterious relief, but she didn't let herself rely on it. She continued to work, saving every dollar she could, trying to build a future on the foundation of her own 2 hands. The arrival of the letter was what shattered the quiet mystery and changed her life forever. It came via a courier, a man in a sharp suit who looked deeply uncomfortable standing in her grease-stained garage. The envelope was thick and creamy, made of expensive cardstock, bearing the embossed letterhead of Prescott, Thorne and Davies, one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. Maya's heart plummeted. Her first thought was that the other shoe had finally dropped. This had to be a lawsuit. Maybe she had unknowingly damaged Harrison's boat. Maybe the anonymous payments were a prelude to some complex legal action. With trembling hands, she wiped them clean on a rag and accepted the envelope. She waited until the courier had driven away before daring to open it. She sat on an overturned 5-gallon bucket, the heavy envelope feeling like a death sentence in her hands. She slid her finger under the seal and pulled out a sheaf of thick, formal documents. The first page was a letter. It began, "Dear Miss Lee, on behalf of our client, the Eleanor Harrison Heritage Marine Foundation, we are delighted to contact you regarding a matter of significant interest. The Eleanor Harrison Foundation?" Maya read the line again. She had no idea what it was. The letter continued, and with each sentence, the world tilted further on its axis. "It has come to our client's attention that your father, Mr. Robert Lee, has been facing certain healthcare-related financial burdens. We are pleased to inform you that the Foundation's board, in its inaugural act of philanthropy, has voted unanimously to assume and settle his complete medical debt, past, present, and future." Maya's vision blurred. She read the sentence a third time, then a fourth. Settle his complete medical debt. The words were impossible, a fantasy. The weight she had been carrying on her shoulders for years, a crushing burden that had shaped every decision she made, simply evaporated. She felt lightheaded, dizzy with a relief so profound it felt like a physical shock. But the letter wasn't finished. Furthermore, the Foundation's primary mission is the preservation and restoration of classic and historically significant marine vessels. It is a mission, we are told, that aligns perfectly with your own unique and considerable talents. To that end, the Foundation has recently acquired the property at 7 Pier Road, formerly the Pier 7 Imports Warehouse. Maya knew the building. It was a massive, derelict brick structure right on the water, a place she had driven past 1,000 times, wondering what stories its empty shell held. The Foundation hereby wishes to extend a formal offer. We propose to fund the complete renovation of this property, transforming it into a world-class marine restoration facility. We would handle all capital investment, equipment acquisition, and administrative overhead. In return, we would like to offer you the position of head engineer and chief curator of the facility. The position comes with a competitive annual salary, full health benefits for you and your father, and operational autonomy. The new enterprise will bear your family's name. We have taken the liberty of registering the business name Lee Heritage Marine in your honor. This is not a gift, Miss Lee. It is a partnership. Our client believes that talent like yours should be nurtured and given the resources to flourish. You have a gift for making old things sing again. We wish to provide you with a concert hall. Attached to the letter were architectural renderings of the proposed workshop, a beautiful, light-filled space with gleaming lifts, advanced diagnostic bays, and a library for historical research. There was also a formal employment contract detailing a salary figure that made Maya's head spin. She dropped the papers onto the grimy concrete floor. The cool, rational part of her brain told her this was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and caffeine. But the heavy, expensive paper in her hands, the crisp, legal language, it was all undeniably real. The dam of emotion she had been holding back for years finally broke. She put her head in her hands and wept. Not tears of sadness or despair, but tears of overwhelming, cathartic relief. She cried for her father, for the years of struggle, for the end of the constant grinding fear. She cried for the sheer, unbelievable kindness of a man she had met only once. Arthur Harrison hadn't just paid her invoice. He hadn't just given her a generous tip. He had seen her. He had understood the entirety of her struggle and had decided, with his immense power, to solve it. He hadn't offered her a handout that might insult her pride. He had offered her an opportunity, a position of respect that honored her talent and her family's legacy. He had given her a future. After the tears subsided, a frantic, joyful energy took over. She scooped up the papers, her hands still shaking, and practically ran to her truck. She drove to the hospital, breaking at least 3 traffic laws on the way. She burst into her father's room, waving the letter like a winning lottery ticket. He was sitting in a comfortable armchair near the window, a blanket over his lap, watching the boats in the distant harbor. He looked better than he had in a decade, his breathing easy and unlabored. "Dad!" she gasped, out of breath. "Dad, you are not going to believe this." She knelt by his chair, and her voice cracking with emotion, read the letter aloud. She watched his face as the words sank in. His tired eyes widened. His mouth fell slightly open. When she read the part about his medical debt being erased, he reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. By the time she got to the part about Lee Heritage Marine, tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks as well. "He's a good man," Robert Lee whispered, his voice thick. "That Harrison—" "He's more than that," Maya said, her own tears starting anew. He's a miracle." They sat there for a long time, hand in hand, the letter resting on the blanket between them. The setting sun streamed through the window, bathing the small hospital room in a warm golden light. It felt like the first day of the rest of their lives. The long vigil was over. A new, unexpected inheritance, one not of money, but of opportunity, respect, and profound kindness, had just been delivered. 6 months later, the air at 7 Pier Road no longer smelled of decay and dust. It smelled of fresh paint, curing varnish, and the clean, hopeful scent of possibility. The cavernous, derelict warehouse had been reborn. Sunlight streamed through massive new skylights, illuminating a workshop that was a perfect fusion of old-world craftsmanship and modern technology. On one side, a gleaming hydraulic lift held the hull of a 1,952nd Chris Craft speedboat. On the other, a young apprentice was carefully sanding a mahogany rudder. And at the center of it all, leaning over a drafting table covered in vintage boat schematics, was Maya Lee. She wore new overalls, clean and perfectly fitted, with Lee Heritage Marine embroidered in elegant blue script over the pocket. The exhaustion that had once been etched onto her features was gone, replaced by a calm, confident energy. She was no longer just surviving. She was thriving. She moved through the workshop with the easy authority of a conductor guiding her orchestra, offering a quiet word of advice to her apprentice, checking the calibration on a new piece of equipment, her passion now, her profession. Her team was small but dedicated, 2 young, eager mechanics she had personally chosen for their passion rather than their credentials. She was teaching them the old ways, the language of listening that she had learned from her father. Robert Lee himself was a fixture in the workshop. He sat in a comfortable leather armchair in a corner office with a large window overlooking the marina, a position he jokingly referred to as chief of storytelling. His health had improved beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Freed from the stress of debt and with the best possible care, he had regained a spark that Maya hadn't seen in years. He couldn't do the heavy lifting anymore, but his mind was sharp, and he would spend hours regaling clients with tales of classic engines and the golden age of boating. His presence, a living link to the heritage in their company's name. The massive bay doors of the workshop were wide open to the sea breeze, and just outside, docked in the slip that came with the property, was the Serenity. She looked more beautiful than ever. her brass gleaming, her hull a mirror reflecting the sparkling water. The bell over the office door chimed, and Arthur Harrison walked in, carrying a box of pastries. He no longer wore the armor of a corporate raider. Dressed in a casual linen shirt and slacks, he looked less like a reclusive billionaire and more like what he had become, a friend. "Thought your crew might need some fuel," he said, setting the box down. He had become a regular, welcome presence at the workshop. The Eleanor Harrison Heritage Marine Foundation was his new passion. He had channeled his formidable business acumen into its success, but his involvement was deeply personal. He wasn't just a benefactor, he was a partner. "Perfect timing, Arthur," Maya said with a warm smile. "We were just about to take a break." "How was the meeting with the museum?" "Productive," he said, his eyes gleaming with a new purpose. "They've agreed to let us restore the Sea Dragon, the sailboat that won the 2062 Trans-Pacific Yacht Race. They thought she was a lost cause." "There's no such thing as a lost cause," Maya said, the words now a core tenet of her life. They stood together for a moment, looking out at the workshop, at the new life blossoming within the old brick walls. They were an unlikely pair, the young mechanic who listened to machines and the older billionaire who was finally learning to listen to his heart. Their friendship, forged in an engine room, was built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared understanding of what truly mattered. Later that afternoon, as the workday wound down, Arthur turned to Maya. "The tide is perfect. Fancy a ride?" An hour later, they were gliding out of the harbor aboard the Serenity. Maya was at the helm, her hand resting lightly on the polished mahogany wheel. Arthur stood beside her, not as her employer, but as her guest. The engine, the catalyst for everything, hummed its perfect, resonant song beneath them. It was a sound of gratitude, a constant reminder of the day their lives had changed. They sailed in comfortable silence for a while, watching the coastline shrink and the vast expanse of the Pacific open up before them. "You know," Arthur said, his voice thoughtful as he looked at the horizon, "for years I measured my life by acquisitions, companies, properties, assets. I thought wealth was something you built to protect yourself from the world." He turned to look at her, a genuine, heartfelt smile on his face. "You taught me that true wealth isn't a fortress. It's a bridge. It's measured by the connections we forge, the good we can do, not the things we own." Maya smiled back, her heart full. "My dad taught me that every engine has a story," she said. "I guess people do too. Sometimes they just need someone to help them find the right key to get started again." They were two such stories, two souls who had been stuck, now sailing together towards a hopeful sunset. The quiet mechanic and the lonely billionaire, healed by an unlikely connection, their futures inextricably linked by the steady, enduring heartbeat of serenity. Sometimes, the most powerful engines aren't the ones that move boats, but the ones that move hearts. A simple act of integrity, a moment of empathy, can set in motion a ripple effect that changes lives in ways we can never predict. Thank you for joining us on this journey at Upstory. We hope Maya and Arthur's story reminded you of the power that lies in kindness and character. What did you think of Maya's choice? Let us know in the comments below. And if you believe that one good deed can change the world, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can join us for our next uplifting story. Until next time, remember that the best parts of your story are the ones you write with your heart.